What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 4 running back start-sit video. So talking about every single Week 4 matchup, talking about every single fantasy-relevant running back, and listing them as either a start, fringe option, or a sit. The starts are going to be the running backs you trust in your lineup as your RB1, your RB2s. These are strong options, in your fantasy football lineup. The fringe options, more of your RB3s, the flex plays, they're fine, but you don't feel overly excited throwing these guys into your lineup. And then the sits, obviously going to be players that you would prefer to keep on your bench. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe. Any questions, drop them down below. I'll make sure to get back to every single person. But let's just dive right into the Thursday night matchup here, where we have the Cowboys taking on the Giants. And for the Cowboys here, you would think this would be a decent spot to play one of these running backs. Could be a favorable game script. They go ahead early. We're able to put up some points here against the Giants. But this is just so much of a split here. I don't think we can trust either of these guys. We saw Rico Dowdle pull away a little bit from Zeke in terms of the opportunities, the snaps, but now their fullbacks getting involved on passing downs. It's still just a very gross committee here. So I'm going to be sitting Rico Dowdle and Ezekiel Elliott. Then looking at the Giants here, I could see an argument for Devin Singletary being a start. He's coming off his best fantasy game of the season. You also look at the Cowboys. They've just been shredded on the ground over the past couple of games. But like the Giants with Devin Singletary, it's a lot different than Lamar Jackson and, Derrick Henry running all over you. It's a lot different than the Saints offense in the first 2 weeks where you have Kamara running all over you. It's definitely a step down in competition. So I think Devin Singletary is more of like that high-end RB3 area, but definitely someone who's still playable. And then sitting Tyrone Tracy, who's starting to carve out a little bit of a role within this Giants offense, but certainly not fantasy relevant at this point. Now shifting over to a divisional matchup between the Saints and the Falcons. This is pretty easy here. Obviously for the Saints, you fire up Alvin Kamara as a very strong running back one. And then for the Falcons, you fire up Bijan Robinson. Bijan hasn't had like that nuclear game yet, but the usage is there. He's playing at a very high level. His monster games are going to come. And then sitting his running back two in Tyler Algier. Now looking at the Bengals taking on the Panthers. For the Bengals here, I talked about Zach Moss as a buy low after week 2. Hopefully you're able to buy low on him because his usage once again was fantastic. 76% snap share, 71% route participation. He took 12 of the 19 running back carries. He took 6 of the 9 running back targets. He also gets a pretty favorable matchup here against the Panthers. So I feel like you fire up Zach Moss with a lot of confidence. And then Chase Brown, he's still definitely worth being rostered. Had a decent game with his opportunities in week 3, but at this point, he just doesn't have the workload to be startable. So could he still work his way into like a 50-50 split? Does he have handcuff upside? Yes. But as of right now, not someone who I'd want to be playing in my lineup. I think it's also a good sign that just in a game script where they were trailing, Zach Moss was still getting solid usage, because I think heading into the season, like a trailing game script probably would have favored Chase Brown, the guy who has more receiving upside, but it was still Zach Moss dominating those opportunities and getting involved as a pass catcher. Now looking at the Panthers here, I want to start off by talking about Chuba Hubbard, and he had a monster week 3 with Andy Dalton taking over, and shout out to him. If you played him, congrats. It was a great performance, but I do still have some concerns here heading into week 4, because I do feel like for this Panthers offense as a whole, week 3 was very close to a peak game. Deontay Johnson dominated. Andy Dalton, just played out of his mind. And then, like I said, Chuba Hubbard had a monster stat line, both on the ground and through the air. But I do think there are ways where, this maybe doesn't go as great as people are expecting here in week 4, because we did see Miles Sanders run more routes than Chuba Hubbard, which could lead to problems in a trailing game script. So if the Bengals go ahead early, the Panthers are passing it more, they're not, running a million times a game, I do think we could see Miles Sanders get more snaps than we've seen in previous weeks. Also, despite the Bengals, defense just, letting whatever up to the Commanders here, their run defense was actually very solid. They pretty much shut down Brian Robinson Jr., so they were getting everything done through the air. But in terms of stopping the run, the Bengals actually did a pretty good job of it. So for Chuba Hubbard, I think he's more in that high-end RB3 territory. I just wouldn't, completely overreact to what we saw in week 3. And then I'm going to be sitting Miles Sanders, even though he could be more involved. Definitely think he is going to be a sit here. Now looking at the Rams taking on the Bears, For the Rams, I mean, they are not budging on this Kyren Williams usage. They are force-feeding him. You have to be firing him up as a running back one. Also, just a great sign that with all the injuries to this offense, Kyren Williams could still go out and rip a great game against a very good 49ers defense. Now, looking at these Bears running backs, I mean, this backfield is a complete mess. And as a Bears fan, the DeAndre Swift signing is just looking like an absolute disaster. He is by far the most rushing yards under expected out of all the running backs in the NFL. The Colts coming into this game, coming into week 3, had given up back-to-back 150-yard rushers. Swift goes in, carries the ball 13 times for 20 yards. He's averaging 1.8 yards per carry through 3 games. So DeAndre Swift has just been miserable, both for fantasy and from a real-life NFL perspective. You look at Roschon Johnson here, who had been inactive for the first 2 games. He logs 8 carries, 5 targets. He leads all these running backs in rushing and receiving yards. But then you also factor in that Khalil Herbert took 5 of the 7 goal line snaps. So right now we have kind of a 3-headed committee here on an offense that hasn't looked great. I don't think you can trust, any of these dudes in your lineup. I think maybe Roschon Johnson's the dude who has at least like some hope here, because maybe he overtakes Swift. He's a big running back. Like maybe he could also weasel his way into the goal line opportunities. But as of right now, I mean, you just have to be sitting all those dudes. And if you drafted DeAndre Swift, I mean, it's close to looking like wraps here. Now in a divisional matchup between the Vikings and the Packers, for the Vikings, I mean, this has been a dream start for Aaron Jones. I feel like you draft Aaron Jones, you're hoping he's a mid to back end RB2, just a solid week-to-week play. There's probably, some uncertainty with this Vikings offense. The Vikings offense has smashed. Aaron Jones has smashed. You fire him up as a very strong start, and then sitting his backup in Ty Chandler. Then for the Packers here, Josh Jacobs has been disappointing fantasy-wise, but from like a real-life perspective, he's handling a large workload. He's been super efficient on the ground, so I think things will get better here. I think he'll also just carry more touchdown upside once Jordan Love is back, so I'm still firing up Josh Jacobs. I do think, though, that Emmanuel Wilson is a very solid waiver wire pickup. The handcuff running back here for Josh Jacobs, you have Marshawn Lloyd on IR. I think Wilson with a Jacobs injury could become, very useful here for fantasy. Now looking at the Jaguars taking on the Texans, I mean, that was an embarrassing game out of the Jaguars here. This team, I mean, it almost looks like they're folding 3 weeks into the season. I still think you fire up Travis Etienne. If they're winning, he'll be fine. They're putting up points, he'll be solid. Even if they're trailing, he can, rack up empty receptions. He'll be fine. I mean, if he's not performing, it's more of like he's an RB2, and if the offense figures it out, he's an RB1. So Travis Etienne, I think you're still playing him despite the offense looking terrible. And then sitting Tank Bigsby here still has a role, but I mean, not even close to being startable. And then for the Texans here, this is honestly just kind of a tough situation to navigate because we don't know what's going on with these injuries. So Joe Mixon, Dameon Pierce, both missed in week 3. We saw Cam Akers play. Had solid usage. It just really was not a great game script with them kind of getting blown out by the Vikings. So this is pretty much assuming that all these dudes are healthy. Obviously, if Mixon's healthy and active, you're playing him. If we see Mixon miss and Pierce is back, then I'm probably trying to avoid this backfield because it could be a close split between Pierce and Akers. If Mixon and Pierce both miss once again, then I would be listing Cam Akers here as a start, and I think you fire him up as a solid play. Now looking at the Steelers taking on the Colts, for the Steelers here, we get another game with very strong Najee Harris usage. He logs 18 carries, 4 targets. We saw that Jaylen Warren was pulled from this game with a knee injury. Not quite sure how serious it is, but I mean, at this point, it's very clear Najee Harris is going to be the guy who's racking up the opportunities. He has already logged 17, 18, and 20 carry games. And these are games where Warren's in the lineup, at least to start off, where he's out there and Najee Harris is still being force-fed. I think he has such a high workload floor where, depending on the matchup, he could get involved as a pass catcher, especially with this Warren injury. And if the game's close, they're going to be wanting to run the ball a ton. So I think he has to be considered to start at this point. Hasn't smashed for fantasy because the touchdowns haven't been there. He hasn't been overly efficient, but I think at worst he's like a back-end RB2 this week. And then sitting Jaylen Warren if he does play, and then sitting Cordero Patterson, who in the year of 2024 is somehow still involved. I mean, shout out to Arthur Smith for managing to have that happen here. And then for the Colts, I mean, this is a no-brainer. Obviously, you're firing up Jonathan Taylor, coming off a very strong game against the Bears. Now, looking at the Broncos taking on the Jets, for the Broncos, I mean, this running back room looks like a disaster. You've had Javonte Williams and Jaleel McLaughlin kind of going back and forth with the usage through the first 3 games. Those are the people that I think most people expected to be like the top 2 heading into the season. Neither of them have really been able to do anything, so they've both been very disappointing. Then they roll out Tyler Beatty, who ends up leading the team in carries and is very efficient with those opportunities. I mean, maybe we go out week 4 and Tyler Beatty's like the lead back. I don't really know what to make of this situation. I feel like that one decent game out of Beatty is probably just like random luck, right? We've seen Javonte and Jaleel McLaughlin both be like ultra inefficient. So I think we sit all these dudes. I don't think we have like the full answer on what this backfield is going to look like. And regardless of who's like the lead guy, I don't really think we want to be starting any of these dudes at this point. And then for the Jets, continue to fire up Breece Hall as a very strong play. I think some people might be a little bit worried about Braylon Allen. For me, Breece Hall, even though Allen's been involved, he's still handling the valuable touches, the 2-minute drill work, the receiving opportunities. He's the guy on the goal line. And so if Braylon Allen's limiting him from having like 21, 22 opportunities instead of having like 28, 29, I don't really need my workhorse running back with receiving upside, touchdown upside on a decent offense to be carrying the ball or getting the ball 29, 30 times a game. I feel like you're just going to wear him down and lead to injury. So Breece Hall, fire him up as a start. Braylon Allen has been very good in his opportunities, but like I said, he's just not getting the valuable touches, so it's tough to truly trust him. I think in like good matchups when we have bye weeks, injuries, he could be playable as like a fringe option, but with no bye weeks, he would be a sit for me. Now looking at the Eagles taking on the Buccaneers. For the Eagles, Saquon, no-brainer, fire him up as a start. For the Buccaneers here, this is kind of an interesting spot with these running backs, Rachaad White, Bucky Irving, because I do think this is a week where we could see a significant shift in how these running backs are used. We've seen Rachaad White, kind of dominate the snaps, dominate the routes early on in the season, but Bucky Irving has just consistently outproduced him week after week. Bucky Irving has taken 25 carries at 6.2 yards per carry. Rachaad White has taken 31 carries for 2.1 yards per carry. So long-term at this point, I'd probably favor Bucky Irving, but for this specific week when we haven't really seen the usage completely flip, I know Bucky Irving out-carried him, but Rachaad White was still the clear leader in terms of the snaps. I think we have to sit both of these dudes until we get a clearer picture of what this backfield is going to look like moving forward. Now we're going to have the Commanders taking on the Cardinals, and we have the Commanders coming off of a great offensive performance here against the Bengals. And even though Brian Robinson Jr. was very inefficient, I think he's going to be a very strong play this week. We saw him get into the end zone, and then we also saw Austin Eckler leave with, I believe, a concussion. And if you're getting a concussion on Monday night, the odds of you turning around and playing Sunday are going to be very, very low. So we really could see like 3-down workhorse Brian Robinson Jr. here. And if we do get that, he is obviously going to be a very strong play. And then looking at the Cardinals here with James Conner, didn't have a great game in week 3, but he was very productive week 1, week 2. The usage is still there. I think you fire up James Conner as a very strong start as like an RB2 option. Now looking at the Patriots taking on the 49ers. For the Patriots here, I saw some people thought I had Ramondre a little bit too low in my week 3 rankings, and it just came down to the fact that I didn't think his week 1, week 2 production and efficiency was going to be sustainable. Ramondre Stevenson is a very good running back. He's a good runner. He has some receiving upside, but when you run an offense like this Patriots team that, straight up, it's not a very good unit, your weekly floor is going to be fairly low, and you can have those dud games. We saw one of those dud games in week 3 where, he pretty much killed you in your fantasy football lineup. I still think he's playable as like a mid to back end RB2, but I think some people maybe thought he was going to be like a running back 1 rest of season. And unless we see a significant turnaround from this offense, the offensive line, I just don't think he's going to be that guy this year. Not a talent issue, just more of a situation issue. And then for the 49ers here, you fire up Jordan Mason. They're still feeding him a great start. And then going to be sitting Isaac Guerendo, who at this point looks like the Jordan Mason handcuff with CMC out. Now we're going to have the Chiefs taking on the Chargers. And for the Chiefs here, I think a lot of people were interested in looking at this running back room. How was the split going to be between Carson Steele, Samaje Perine? And I kind of planted my flag on Carson Steele, and I'm feeling pretty good about that call. He took a 62% snap share, had a 55% route participation. He took 17 of the 23 running back carries. He took 2 of the 5 targets, and then he took 2 of the 3 goal line carries or the goal line snaps. So I think better games should be ahead here. He's going to have some touchdown upside, and I think he's a fine running back 2 at this point. And then I'm going to be sitting Samaje Perine. Could definitely be relevant in game scripts where the Chiefs are trailing, but it's just going to be tough to kind of predict those games where the Chiefs are getting blown out or, have to surmount a large comeback. And I just don't think this is one of those spots here against the Chargers. And then for the Chargers, I kind of got a lot of grief from people for underranking J.K. Dobbins, or they thought I underranked J.K. Dobbins last week. And the point I was making was that if he's in a full-on split with Gus Edwards, which is what we saw through 2 weeks, then it's tough for me to be all in on him until we see him kind of separate. We finally did see J.K. Dobbins separate. He took 15 of the 18 running back carries. He took all 3 targets. His efficiency was not good. It kind of came back down to earth, but it's still a good sign moving forward. I think he's a start. Obviously, without Justin Herbert, that would be a hit, and maybe he's more of like a high-end RB3 just because there's no threat through the air. But at this point, if Herbert's playing, I think he's like a back-end to mid-tier RB2. If Herbert's out, probably more in that RB3 area. And then sitting Gus Edwards, who is pretty much a non-factor. Now we're going to have the Browns taking on the Raiders. And this Browns running back usage has pretty much been all over the place. Week 1, it looked like Jerome Ford was going to be the workhorse. Then week 2, Jerome Ford's usage completely fell off. Deonta Foreman had 14 carries. He dropped that down to 2 carries here in week 3. Ford had strong usage once again, 79% snap share, 64% route participation, but it only led to 10 carries for 37 yards and then 3 receptions for 33 yards. This Browns offense is just rough. There's going to be limited scoring opportunities. And then the one goal line snap that they didn't have a running back in there. So who knows what the split looks like. If I knew he was going to repeat what we saw this week, you could pitch an argument that he's like a back-end RB2. But I mean, they just randomly gave Deonta Foreman 14 carries week 2. So I don't think we can be locked in on really feeling great about what the usage is going to look like. So Jerome Ford is going to be a fringe option for me, an RB3. And then I'm going to be sitting Deonta Foreman here. Like I said, coming off a 2-carry game, no trust with him in my lineup. Now looking at these Raiders running backs, I mean, it looks like Zamir White is cooked at this point. He had 10 carries, but just logging 10 more inefficient carries with no receiving upside and limited touchdown upside is just not going to get it done. He was outsnapped by Alexander Madison and Amir Abdullah, and he is just so game script dependent, and he's dependent on a game script that's not going to come up a lot here for the Raiders. The spot where Zamir White is a great play is the Raiders are just blowing out a team. They're trying to run out the clock, and they're just force-feeding Zamir White. The problem is, that perfect game script should have come last week against the Panthers, but then the Raiders getting blown out. So if you can't trust them to get a lead on the Panthers, who are you going to trust them to do that against? So I think all these running backs just have to be firm sits at this point. Disappointing, but I mean, Zamir White has been useless through 3 weeks. Now looking at a pretty solid running back matchup here, we have the Bills taking on the Ravens. For the Bills here, you have to feel great about what you've gotten out of James Cook. He's getting some more of those goal line looks, has more touchdown upside. Obviously, he's going to be involved as a pass catcher. So I think James Cook, you fire him up as a running back 1. Sitting Ty Johnson, sitting Ray Davis, those depth options. And then for the Ravens here, Derrick Henry's coming off a monster game. I don't think this is the best matchup just in terms of the potential game script, right? Because we know in games where the Ravens are trailing, Derrick Henry kind of gets phased out for Justice Hill. So this could be one of those games, but I mean, Derrick Henry, even in those matchups, is still a very strong start. And then sitting his RB2, Justice Hill. Now looking at the Titans taking on the Dolphins. For the Titans here, we once again saw solid usage from Tony Pollard. It just didn't lead to great fantasy production. He'll be fine. I think you still fire him up as an RB2. But kind of similar to a guy like Ramondre Stevenson, when you're not on a great offense, it's going to limit your overall floor. So even if the usage is there, if you're playing on this Titans offense and the ball's not moving, it's going to be tough for you, in certain weeks to put up legit fantasy production. And then sitting the running back 2, Tajay Spears. Now looking at the Dolphins here, Devon Achane not coming off a great game. This Dolphins offense looked bad. I still think you're playing him. He's the clear-cut running back 1. He's going to have big play upside, so maybe he's not a high-end RB1 like we would have seen if Tua was healthy, but still someone who I'd consider in my top 12. At worst, he's a very strong running back 2 play. Now we're going to have the Seahawks taking on the Lions here. I believe this is the final game of the week, and for the Seahawks, if Kenneth Walker misses another game, I mean, Zach Charbonnet is a no-brainer start. If Walker's active, it definitely complicates things because is he going to have a full workload? We'll kind of wait and see on that. But for Charbonnet, he had a monster week 3, 84% snap share, 76% route participation. He had 18 carries for 91 yards, 2 touchdowns, also caught 3 passes on 4 targets for 16 yards. So if Kenneth Walker misses, it's easy. You fire up Charbonnet. And then for the Lions here, I mean, both Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery have been very solid options through 3 weeks. So you fire up both those dudes as very strong starts. And that is going to wrap it up for my week 4 running back start sits. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe. Any questions, drop them down below. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.